Hello, it's good to see you. Today I have in this folder my Ancestry.com results. I tried not to look at them, which is kind of hard to do if you're the one printing them out. Um, but I just kind of blocked the screen and I was just kind of trying to print it. Anyway, they're in here, and I also printed out some just some basic history and background of the people from the different parts of the world where my ancestors came from, and some information about their journey to America and maybe some of the things that helped influence their decisions. So what I want to do, I haven't looked at it, except I'll be honest, I did see the first one, although it wasn't a huge surprise. I'm going to read my results for you, and then if you're interested, I'm going to just read the other stuff. Now, there's quite a bit of history. It goes all the way back to 1700. So I'm going to read that if you want to stick around to listen to that part. So I know the first thing, but I didn't see any of the rest of it. And it's on top on the pages in here. I feel like Maury Povich kind of. You are the ancestor. Okay. I'm going to open this up and I'm going to tell you what my results were. If you've ever had this done, it's really neat. So I'm kind of curious to see. One of the reasons I'm curious is because there's some mystery about where my dad's my paternal grandparents' family. There's some uncertainty about where they came from. So I'm wondering if this will shed some light on that. I don't know. So let's take a look and see. Okay. All right. Ethnicity. This is the ethnicity estimate. And this is the one I saw, and this is no big shock. Great Britain, 46%. So I'm almost half that. Ireland /Scotland / Wales, 26%. That makes sense. Okay, now this is weird. Now this I have never heard. Scandinavia, 10%. That I didn't expect. I've never heard anybody say that we had any family from Scandinavia at all. So that's pretty cool. Now that's the largest percentages, and then you get down into what they call low confidence regions. Europe East, 5%. Iberian Peninsula, 5%. Europe South, 3%. Europe West, 3%. Africa North, 1%. And then Caucasus, less than 1%. That doesn't really clear up much. The Scandinavia thing is interesting, though. No, as far as I know, I have no information of any ancestors from there at all. And that wasn't the two countries it was down to as far as where we think they came from. Scandinavia was not one of those. So that's weird. So it's mostly Great Britain, Ireland / Scotland / Wales, looks like. That makes up 72% of me. Yay! All right, cool. That's neat. Specific places in this region where your family might have lived. Carolina border settlers. Also Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee settlers. Well, they got the Carolina part right. That's where, that's where most of my family is in North Carolina. So anyway, that's basically it. It's pretty short and sweet. There's not much else to say about it. Okay, that's about what I expected, except for the Scandinavia part. That's interesting. And my mom and my brother had the same test done, and neither one of them had Scandinavia in their report. I don't think it was in there at all. I don't think they mentioned Scandinavia at all. Okay. So the rest of this stuff, if you're interested, I'm going to read to you some history on here going back to 1700. So that's going to make up the rest of the video. Just me reading. All right, and it's broken down into little increments. The first one is 1700 to 1750. Overview. Land and cotton lured European settlers into the Deep South. Many descended from German and Scots-Irish settlers from Pennsylvania and English colonists from Virginia and North Carolina's coastal plains. They pushed down the Piedmont Plateau, that's where I live, until cotton brought them deep into the South. Some became rich planters. Others were small farmers or, after the Civil War, even sharecroppers until they turned to industries like oil and steel in cities like Houston, Birmingham, and Atlanta. Others wandered farther afield, transplanting Southern culture in their new homes. Southern states settlers. Melting pot in the American colonies. Many English immigrants who went to Virginia in the 17th and early 18th century were the second or third sons of landed gentry who chose to leave Britain to support themselves because of the inheritance laws that favored firstborn sons. Hundreds of indentured servants followed the men to labor on cotton and tobacco plantations that thrived in Virginia and North Carolina. They were joined by Scots-Irish who were fleeing political unrest and peasants from southwestern Germany who were devastated by famine and decades of war. Now, as far as I know, my father's family went all the way back to a single pregnant young woman who came here by herself around 1900. And there is some discrepancy as to where we're not quite sure where she came from. She said she was from Germany, but there's some other stuff that makes that doesn't really make sense. But anyway, she's the one that we all wonder about. We're not entirely sure where she came from. And she did come here by herself. She was unmarried and pregnant and had a child here in the United States, and she had a boy, and that was my first ancestor born here, and he was born, I think, in the early 1900s. Okay. Then we go to 1750 to 1775. Southern states settlers. Again, life in the backcountry. In the backcountry, tobacco was a cash crop, but farmers also raised wheat, corn, and livestock. Tradesmen built mills along the swift streams of the Piedmont, and among the small towns or in home industries were brewers, wheelwrights, hat makers, and weavers. Towns often formed along ethnic lines, so a Scots-Irish village might be a few miles from another village made up of Germans. Central North Carolina, southeast Missouri, and southern Illinois settlers. Following the Great Wagon Road. English and German immigrants continued to settle the American colonies from Pennsylvania to the Carolinas. As these northern colonies became more crowded and land became scarce, many settlers followed the Great Wagon Road to western North Carolina. The new settlers found it difficult to navigate the rugged land and often faced conflict with the local Native American tribes. However, the promise of inexpensive, fertile farmland kept a steady flow of pioneers coming to the area. 1775 to 1800, a land for the hardy. As populations grew, settlers kept working south along the Piedmont Plateau. Military land grants for service in the Revolutionary War and a treaty negotiated with Cherokee leaders included acreage in modern-day Tennessee and Kentucky. Life was full of hard work and danger. Social activities included community hunts, house raisings, and quilting parties, but loneliness was one of the challenges. In South Carolina, where diseases like malaria and yellow fever were common, death was common too. People tended to revel in life and pleasure, from music and theater to hunting. Central North Carolina, southeast Missouri, and southern Illinois settlers. Shielded from the Revolution. While none of the American colonies escaped turmoil during the Revolutionary War, the mountainous terrain in western North Carolina meant few battles were fought there. Traveling was arduous and trade was difficult, so most farmers grew only what they needed. They also hunted, fished, and raised livestock to support their families. On the Great Wagon Road. The majority of North Carolina's early settlers stayed in the coastal region because of its abundance of natural resources and because its western mountains and swamps made transportation to the interior difficult. But as land on the coast became scarce, some settlers pushed west into the colony's mountainous region, while others followed the Great Wagon Road to South Carolina and Georgia. And then we go to 1800 to 1825. The land of cotton. America's thirst for land grew along with its population. The one-time settlers of the Piedmont and their descendants kept pushing south along the plateau and west along the national and wilderness roads. Much of the soil in South Carolina and Virginia had been depleted, and the market for tobacco had declined, but cotton was booming. The Mississippi Territory had been opened for settlement in 1798, and the land there offered the perfect combination of fertile soil and warm climate for cotton cultivation. Frontier families were on the move again to Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, chasing fortune, security, or just a little more land. Carolina Gold Rush. Now, I have heard of this. This may be something you did not know about. There was a gold rush in North Carolina in the 1800s. I need to take you to some of the gold mines around here. Oh, you'd love it. In the early 1800s, the discovery of gold in western North Carolina brought a rush of settlers who dreamed of striking it rich. The economy thrived with the influx, but then declined when the gold diggers left to follow a new call to California. By the 1830s, more people were leaving the state than were born there each year. But yeah, for a little time there, we had a little gold boom here. And there are still places here you can go pan for gold. We got to go do that. Okay. The Rip Van Winkle State. Large tobacco, rice, and cotton plantations dotted the North Carolina coast. Slave-produced products grew the economy. However, the state lagged behind in transportation and industry. Some Americans began calling it the Rip Van Winkle State after the folk tale where Rip Van Winkle falls asleep and wakes up years later to find he's been left behind by everyone he knows. Some pioneers left the sleepy state and headed to new land in Georgia and Alabama. Revolutionary War veterans moved to Tennessee to claim free land grants, and others were lured to Kentucky by Daniel Boone's popular tales about life there. And then we move on to 1825 to 1850. Building the Cotton Kingdom. Treaties, wars, and expulsions opened Indian lands for settlement, and thousands headed south and west to claim new acres and grow more cotton. They lived in a society where social class and position were important. At the top were old aristocracy and wealthy planters who lived on large plantations. Slaveholders with 5 to 20 slaves, some farmers, and other professionals came next. The majority of Southerners were small-time farmers. Some owned a little land, others worked as sharecroppers. My mother's family was sharecroppers. Okay, and again they talk about the Rip Van Winkle State. In the early 1800s, while industrial pursuits were sweeping other states, North Carolina's economy remained focused on agriculture. Some Americans began calling North Carolina the Rip Van Winkle State after the popular folktale where Rip Van Winkle falls asleep and wakes up many years later only to find he's been left behind by all his friends and family. With no faith that conditions would improve in their sleepy state, some pioneers headed to new land in Missouri. Some Revolutionary War veterans received free land grants and headed to Tennessee, while others were lured to Kentucky by Daniel Boone's popular tales about life there. It's basically repeated that paragraph. That's the way it's in here. They did it, not me. 1850 to 1875. A time of war. In the years leading up to the Civil War, many Southerners fled to the relative safety of Texas. From Texas to the Carolinas, the South continued to be dominated by agriculture. Rising cotton prices led to more investment in cotton, slaves, and land than in industry. Large cities and towns were rare because of the economy's rural focus. I always have a hard time saying that word, rural focus. The Civil War upended all of this. A third, and possibly many more, of Confederate troops died, and more than 100,000 were wounded. As the war went on, more and more deserted to return home to defend or try to feed their families. I had one ancestor that was in the Civil War, but he fought for the Union Army, and he was captured and died in a prison camp of dysentery. Choosing sides in the Civil War. Life in the South was tense leading up to the Civil War. During the war, more than 40,000 North Carolina men died fighting for the Confederacy. More suffered from disease and starvation. However, Eastern Tennessee settlers were often loyal to the Union and supplied more soldiers to the North than any other Confederate region. After the war, some fled to Missouri, which had remained in the Union and had seen minimal conflict. While the rest of the South limped through Reconstruction for several decades, Missouri rebounded quickly, holding on to its Southern culture, traditions, and offering a much better life to war-weary Southerners. Fighting for the Confederacy. Life in the South was tense leading up to the Civil War. During the war, hundreds of thousands of men from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama served for the Confederacy. More than 40,000 North Carolina men died fighting, and more suffered from disease and starvation. Blockades prevented farmers from trading their goods and also led to shortages. As inflation increased, the price of goods like bread, salt, and shoes skyrocketed. Many people could not afford these basic necessities. Even coffee went from about 14 cents to more than $5 a pound. That was a lot back then. Old times there are not forgotten. Cotton still reigned as both former enslaved African Americans and poor whites got by as sharecroppers, and settlers continued to push westward to plant new lands, especially in Texas. After Reconstruction ended, locals worked to maintain the status quo as best they could. For most, rural farming life went on, but others found new opportunities in the coal and steel industries that grew up around Birmingham or in the petroleum fields of Louisiana and Texas. World War I lured some families north for factory jobs. Rip Van Winkle wakes up. In 1889, the railroad finally arrived in North Carolina and increased the people's ability to trade and change their economic power. The region, already focused economically on agriculture, mining, and lumber, now saw an increase in urban textile mills and other factories, which offered employment for unskilled, low-wage workers, especially failing farmers. Despite the industrial advances in southern Appalachian cities, the mountainous area remained largely rural. And yes, we do pronounce it Appalachian here. If you pronounce it Appalachian, we know you're not from here. It's Appalachian. Eastern North Carolina settlers. The South faced political and economic struggles after the Civil War. The economy could no longer rely on slave-produced agriculture, so planters turned to sharecropping, where poor farmers lived on land in exchange for growing and sharing crops with the landowner. When the cotton trade collapsed in the 1880s, new industries provided hope for many. Textile mills, tobacco processing plants, and the lumber industry offered employment for unskilled, low-wage workers, many of whom were women and children who worked 12-hour days. I have 2 or 3 generations of ancestors who worked in textile mills and lumber mills. Some of my relatives still do work in lumber mills. 1900 to 1925. Let's see. Southern states settlers. That's the same paragraph I just read a minute ago. Hold on. Okay, this goes to Central North Carolina, Southeast Missouri, and Southern Illinois settlers. Some of these paragraphs repeat. It's kind of weird. Urban growth and expanding industries. The railroad, expanding industries, and less reliance on agriculture caused urban centers in the community to explode. Greenville, South Carolina became known as the textile center of the South. While land became more difficult to come by, Texas and Oklahoma offered a seemingly endless supply of the increasingly rare commodity, and they had the added benefit of Southern culture, Southern climate, and Southern agriculture, mainly cotton, to make the move from home less jarring. Growth in industry. During the early 1900s, there was heavy investment in North Carolina's infrastructure, including expanding roads and providing electricity to rural areas. The once backward state became known as the Good Roads State. We used to have the best roads in the country here. Oh, they're crap now, but they used to be great. Many northern U.S. factories relocated there to take advantage of the cheap labor. Almost a quarter of employees in the tobacco industry were children. Low wages and poor treatment led to discontented workers striking in the 1920s. And then we go to 1925 to 1950. The New South. And as industrialization began to take hold in the South, urbanization came with it. The oil boom in East Texas brought jobs to poor farmers and sharecroppers in the poorest part of the state. Cities like Houston, Dallas, Memphis, Birmingham, and Atlanta drew workers to jobs in factories, transportation, and other industries. Thousands left for factory work in northern and western cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles. While these Southerners faced discrimination, they brought along trappings of Southern life like country music, Southern food, and Pentecostal churches that changed the societies they moved to. A time of transition. As agriculture prices tumbled in the 1920s, farmers sank into debt and many lost their land. However, textile factories and tobacco production provided many jobs, and North Carolina became the leading maker of furniture in America. In fact, High Point, North Carolina is still considered, well, it was, like the furniture capital or something. It's right down the road from where I live. Some people moved to urban centers looking for work. War-related manufacturing, railroad, and military bases allowed Atlanta, Georgia, and Greenville, South Carolina to help the economy in southern Appalachia to recover. A time of transition. This is the eastern North Carolina settlers. Like many other places in the United States post-World War I, North Carolina experienced a dizzying array of highs and lows. Many people sank into debt and lost their farms as manufacturing boomed. North Carolina became the leading maker of furniture in America. During World War II, shipbuilding, ammunition, and radar manufacturing provided many jobs. The community began to migrate from farms to urban areas like Los Angeles, California, Norfolk, Virginia, Durham, North Carolina, and Washington, D.C. So that is just a little bit of history that Ancestry.com provided in my profile. And you can see, I think this is like a timeline, like it shows like these big bubbly areas. This is where the majority of my ancestors landed between 1775 and 1800. And you see it's basically right about smack dab where I am now. And they came over here, like somebody shot them out of a cannon. They went, pew, pew, and then they landed here. That's probably not how it actually went. But then it shows, here it shows how they kind of spread, like from 1800 to 1825, they kind of spread out this way. I mean, there's still a big cluster of them there, but then they spread out. And then 1825 to 1850, you see they spread even more. And we have a larger concentration kind of moving west. And those are, I guess, my ancestors. Now, these apparently didn't print right, but it looks like they just kept going west. I'm assuming that's what that is. So that's pretty cool. It's interesting. It doesn't really shed much light on where my dad's family came from, but maybe I should have my dad do it and see what his results are. That might be interesting. He's never done it. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. That was pretty interesting. I'm glad I did it. Some neat information. Thank you, and I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you again soon.